Hi everyone, welcome to History Doodles. Today we're going to be talking about heroes and hero worship. Why is it so easy for us to get caught up in the myth behind great people, only to set ourselves up for the inevitable fall? This is Napoleon Crossing the Alps. It's painted by Jacques-Louis David. You might have seen it before, it's a very famous painting today. But I want you to imagine that you were one of the lucky people who first got to see it when it was completed in 1801. The first version of this painting was shown to Spanish royalty, nobles and diplomats who were becoming aware of this absolute force of a man showing up on the scene and completely overhauling France and Europe more widely, named Napoleon Bonaparte. They would have seen prints of Napoleon, but nothing like this. This was one of the best artists on the planet, who was once a radical Republican, who made this huge 8.5 foot tall masterpiece of the first consul of France that was commissioned for the King of Spain. And it shows him like a superhero. He's even got a cape. Now, I look at this painting as a man living in the 21st century and see it as an over-the-top propaganda piece, glorifying a guy who caused a lot of suffering in his lifetime. A man a lot more complicated than the hero that is shown here. But it probably didn't seem that over-the-top to the Spanish nobles who first saw it. In the run-up to the creation of this painting, Napoleon had returned from an invasion of Egypt, installed a new government in France at a coup, and had launched an attack on Italy in a way that hadn't been tried in 1,000 years. He seemed invincible, and that's why David's painting shows him as such. We're looking at O.J. Simpson, the NFL rushing leader, not O.J. in the white Bronco. Many later paintings of Napoleon show a much more realistic, drab version of events, as they have the benefit of hindsight to see Napoleon as we do, a flawed egomaniac that, love him or hate him, had his hands in the deaths of millions. But David's painting is so interesting because it's Napoleon at his zenith. And a little historical context really illustrates why. So at the start of the year 1800, Napoleon was at war with a coalition of European nations that wanted to see him overthrown and the Bourbon monarchies of France restored. This is known as the War of the Second Coalition, and it involved France being pitted against the monarchs of Russia, Britain, Austria, Portugal, and the Ottoman Empire. It was a shaky time for Napoleon, and he needed a big win to solidify his power. On May 6th, he met with his army at Geneva, ready to embark on a crossing of the Alps. His plan was to take 50,000 men and horses and cannons and supplies over the St. Bernard Pass, which reaches 8,100 feet of altitude. His plan was to make this crossing and catch the Austrians in northern Italy off guard, and to cut off their line of retreat on the other side. It was a tactic famously used in European history twice before, first by the Carthaginian general Hannibal in 218 BC, and then the Frankish king Charlemagne in 773 AD. And Napoleon wanted to be the third great general to launch a massive attack over the Alps over the course of the last 2,000 years. He got really lucky with the weather, and it wasn't as snowy and icy as it could have been. But it still required a huge group of people to move through a pass that was so narrow at points that it became a single file line to move through. When he did reach the other side, he goes into Milan, and he takes that city. And once inside, on June 4th, he sees an opera, and he receives a standing ovation from the crowd. And then he sleeps with the 27-year-old star of the show. And afterwards, he writes home to his wife, Josephine, telling her not to come to Italy. Once securing the city, he spread out his army over a few possible lines of retreat that the Austrians, under the septuagenarian general Michael von Vellus, could be using. And then on June 13th, Napoleon reaches Marengo, a small northern Italian town surrounded by farmland and vineyards. It's raining, and his scouts fail to recognize that they are walking into the mass of Melis's army, and they are going to be completely outnumbered. A light skirmish happens that night, and by the following morning, the Austrians concentrate their forces and press their advantage. They hit around 24,000 men on their side, outnumbering the 15,000 that the French had. In the morning, the French start getting pounded by the artillery, and they're forced to retreat from Marengo. Pockets of resistance manage to hold back the Austrians, and already at 11 a.m., Napoleon is desperately sending for help for anywhere he could get it, sending one message to the General de Saxe which said, quote, "In the name of God, come back if you still can." Now, Napoleon knew that he not only had to make it out of this thing, but somehow turn it into a victory, because any major news of a setback could reach home and shake the confidence in his very new and shaky consulship, and undermine everything that he had already built. There were many in Paris waiting on such an opportunity, so that they could use it to overthrow his rule. And then, in the battle, Melis's horse was shot out from under him. and he hands over command and leaves the battlefield, thinking that he wasn't even needed in the afternoon to mop up the French resistance. So he leaves and sends word back to Vienna that the battle was won, which turns out to be a little bit premature because at 5 p.m., Desaix arrives with more reinforcements. The French consular guard had managed to hold back the Austrians and give them just enough time to organize a counterattack. And with Desaix and his reinforcements and a perfectly timed cavalry charge by the General Kellerman, the French managed to turn the tide of the battle. And by the end of the day, it was the Austrians who were on the receiving end of a beatdown. Soon afterwards, an armistice was signed that saw the Austrians concede Piedmont, Genoa, and most of Lombardy. As the biographer of Napoleon, Andrew Roberts, puts it, quote, Marengo confirmed Napoleon in his position as first consul and added to the myth of his invincibility. So the next year, 1801, when the King of Spain, Charles IV, commissioned Jacques-Louis David to paint a portrait of Napoleon, this is what resulted. It's really over the top, because the whole story of Napoleon at this time was over the top. In the painting, we see the names of the generals who had crossed the Alps before him, Hannibal and Charlemagne, a feature which Napoleon, who was an avid student of history, would have loved. And the painting itself is really famous for its contrast, not just in the color of his bright uniform against the gray elemental backdrop, but also the calm and confident face of Napoleon, which contrasts the wild, crazy face that the horse is making. This piece was so successful that 4 others were made, so that copies could hang in additional places like Versailles. And in some ways, it marks the introduction of a style of propaganda art that we're all familiar with in the 20th and 21st century, as every leader since Napoleon has recognized the importance of a very carefully curated public image, and they want the visual representations of them to be top-notch, kind of like Napoleon crossing the Alps. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, it'd be really helpful if you can like and subscribe. And I hope to see you next time.